Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world everybody joined from. And good morning to you, Robert. Thank you so much for being here as part of our customer journey webinars. We much appreciate it and we don't take this for granted. So thank you for being there and sharing your journey. Right off the bat, if I may just take a moment and give an introduction to your profile. Robert Iwanik is a software engineer with 15 years of experience in QA and test automation. He's worked on various projects ranging from companies, from startups to large corporations in industries including logistics, media content distribution, databases, banking, and most recently, life sciences as a staff SDET at Illumina. Robert is passionate about software quality, test automation, and solving complex CI problems. In his free time, Robert enjoys spending time with his family, hiking, traveling, paddleboarding, listening to music, and live shows. So Robert, Peter joins me in thanking you for being here. Once again, right off the bat, tell us about your journey, what brought you to the world of development and testing, and if there's anything I missed out in your biodata and your profile.
Well, thank you, Kapil, for this great introduction. You didn't miss anything, and thank you both, Kapil and Peter, for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'm very humbled to be here. My journey started about 15 years ago in this industry. First as a manual tester, but early on I became interested in programming and test automation. I first started scripting in Python, automating some of the repetitive tasks, building utilities for QA activities. But what really accelerated my passion for test automation was my introduction to continuous integration around 2011, I think it was. And in fact, building pipelines in what typically is considered as DevOps domain is another area I really like spending my time in. So with continuous integration, or as commonly as known as CI, you're able to define all or most of the steps into a pipeline and orchestrate them in an automated fashion. And that really spiked my interest, where you can develop your automated tests, and whatever pre and post conditions you have, you can define it all into a pipeline, and then you can set your triggers, and then it just runs by itself. And that whole idea just really fascinated me. So I really went down that path and became really passionate about. And so, as you mentioned, over the years, I've been in various industries, working with different tech stacks, and more specifically for test automation, using tools ranging from custom in-house, developed tools to some of the commonly used ones by the testing community. And currently, I work as a staff SDET at Illumina, and we're as part of the oncology group focusing on providing solutions for medical lab technicians. We're basically developing a platform that supports a number of plugins which help for running some sample prep workflows.
No, wonderful. Thanks for that. And if I may just build further on that, as you mentioned, you're very passionate about solving complex CI problems, quality assurance. In your journey for close to 2 decades now, what has been your biggest frustration with test automation? And what do you see as an opportunity still left untapped in the world of test automation?
Very good question. Well, I think the biggest challenges were to some shortcomings of the frameworks that were available at a time, and also sometimes steep learning curve to implement some of the testing tools. Sometimes lack of documentation was another big culprit. So there's been a number of them, and just some just really intricate scenarios where in one instance I was working with a custom hardware that was developed, that was built, at a company, and we were running a custom software on it. And so to really, I basically had to, build something from scratch using Python, and there's just a lot of hoops to jump through. So those were just some challenges that have come across in the past.
And the opportunity for the future?
Opportunity for the future. We keep hearing about AI and all these methods to streamline test automation and software development in general. I think there are some opportunities there. There's also the whole aspect of visual verification, and I know that more recently karate has introduced that, and there are some other frameworks that have that capability as well. In my case, it hasn't been really that big of a necessity, but I know in the tech world out there, it's definitely something that a lot of teams have a lot of interest in. So I think that could be one of the areas that could expand.
No, thanks for that. And we have our own views on it. We do a lot of deliberation. Many customers that we talk to, we ask them, what generative AI means for them, particularly when it comes to test automation. So as Peter Thiel says in his book, 0 to 1, we might have the last mover advantage on this one because there's a lot of noise out there as it is in the market. So bringing it back to today, or rather your last few years with karate particularly. So what is the tipping point that led you to look for an alternative? Maybe it's some of the points you've already touched on, the ease of onboarding, non-dependence on a programming language. And from there, what led you to Karate Robot? And if you can tell our participants more about Karate Robot, because very few out there are aware, and this is a great platform for it.
Oh, sure. So I first became aware of karate in early 2019, and one of my colleagues, I had just joined a fintech company, and we were in the process of building a platform, replacing an existing platform that was a very monolithic platform into a modern technology using microservices. And we had a series of meetings, kind of talking about architecture and picking the tools that we would use for for our development as well as testing. And so one of my colleagues just kind of briefly mentioned to me karate. And then as part of the kind of a vetting process, I looked at I think at Rest Assured, and it may have been one other tool, but karate quickly spiked my interest. And I think it's a common experience for a lot of people who come across karate. You just have this wow moment almost right away, because it's just so easy to use and so easy to write tests in, and the documentation is absolutely outstanding. It's very comprehensive with a lot of great examples. And so I was actually on a work trip, and one of the tasks during the sprint at the time was to, once we actually identified that karate would be our tool of choice, the next step was to come up with a proof of concept for our small set of API endpoints that we were developing. And so in the midst of traveling and lots of meetings, I basically had to put together a quick presentation proof of concept using karate for our, like I said, API endpoints. And it was just an amazing experience. It was such a breath of fresh air, just being able to within I think like an hour or two, I had a small test suite that I was able to execute pretty quickly. Great results, assertions, all of that was just in place. It was just very easy and joyful to work with. And so that really, and then of course later on that karate became, of course, the deeply embedded into our development process. We were actually using Gradle for building. So running integration tests were part of our build process. We had quality gates set, code scans and everything. So it was just like really well embedded, integrated tool into our development process. And it was a great experience. And another thing was too that it was very easy to collaborate on. Very quickly, actually, the number of developers on the team became interested in, and adding automated tests as well. So it was a joint effort. And just to see how, how easy it was for them to come up to speed on the framework and write tests and kind of stick to the standards that we had was pretty remarkable. So of course that kind of stayed with me. And then, so fast forward 2 roles later, I came to Illumina, and then I was tasked with setting up test automation for this new platform that we're developing. And I have to say I've been overall fortunate in a number of my roles in the in the recent years where I would basically lead the effort and kind of start from scratch. So I had the ability to pick the tools and just kind of architect everything from scratch, and so of course the first tool that came to mind was Karate. Having such a great experience with it in the past, developing API tests, I pretty much assumed that the experience is going to be the same using Karate Robot. And in reality now I actually use all 3 components. I use Robot, I use the Karate Core for web UI automation, as well as the API automation aspect of it as well. And UI tests, UI automation by nature is a lot more difficult than API. And I knew that, right out of the gate. So I wasn't expecting for it to be as smooth sailing, as smooth as it was with API testing. But Karate Robot by far made it a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. There were some bumps that we hit along the way, but the framework itself has really proven itself to make this tremendous effort much easier for us. And it's been it's been great. And I should also mention that at Illumina, since we are FDA regulated company, and we have to really be strict and stick to follow the we're being audited on a regular basis. There is an internal process where we validate all of the tools that we use within our software development group. So it might be of interest to you to know that Karate had to go through an internal validation at Illumina to then be to be able for us to be able to use it as part of our testing activities. So yeah, it's been quite a journey. Like you mentioned in my introduction, and I mentioned it too, I always enjoy challenges, and we faced plenty of them, of course, along the way. But Karate Robot has definitely made that experience a lot easier for us, a lot more enjoyable.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for that detailed insight, Robert. Before we continue with you, Peter, actually, at this point, I have a question for you. It was, 0.9.6 in August 2020 when you released desktop automation, right? What was your tipping point at your role at Intuit that led you to develop and release this?
Yeah, I can talk about that. And I remember this quite well. This was the year of the pandemic, remember, 2020, and collectively the whole world was in a bad place, all working from home, Zoom calls. So I remember the vibe of those days very well. So what happened was the team that I was in had this product which is completely Windows based. It's a Windows thick client desktop application used by customers in the US. I'll not go into too much of detail. So we had this product, it's been around for a while, which is relevant for this discussion because for those who know Windows, I'm not really an expert on Windows development, to be honest, but it was using Delphi and a whole mix of components. I believe some of the components that rendered to the UI were painting pixels. This is what the architect of this product told me. So anyway, we have this massive Windows monolith application, and we didn't have too many tests for that. I believe they were using QTP or Silk test or something similar, but there weren't too many tests. So there was this whole transformation project. There's a burning need to have more test automation for this Windows product, which was actually the source of most of the revenue for our whole group. This is interesting because it's one of the rare, it's something you don't really advise to folks, that create a new framework, because I keep you've heard me, Robert, right? I always advise people, don't reinvent the wheel, just reuse a framework. But here's what happened, and you might relate to this, which is we also did an evaluation at that point in time. What could we use? And one of the options we looked at was WinApp driver, right? Which is interestingly a Microsoft option that has been around for a long time and is supposed to be the solution for testing Windows desktop applications. And when I dug a little deeper, it was clear that the WinApp driver project, and I wish more people were aware of this, it's actually not maintained anymore, right? There's a point around in 2020 where the project leads came and said this project is on hold, hiatus, and it's not been revived ever since. And none of the people responsible on GitHub are responding to any questions. So it's quite interesting for those interested, listening in, there's this massive GitHub issue where, the community has been slightly, reached the limit of their patience, in some ways. So WinApp driver is not an option. There were a couple of other options, like the White framework, if I remember right. But here's the thing, right? Karate had already completed 5 years. Robert has already talked about it a bit. Super mature, does a lot of things already out of the box. HTML reports, this framework, the scripting, approach. And I did a little bit of an experiment to see if we could make calls from Karate to Windows desktop applications, or rather, to the world of DLLs and Microsoft C++ and so on. And some of you would appreciate that this is actually a challenge because Karate happens to be written in Java, right? It's primarily a Java framework. But short story, to cut a long story short, we figured out a way in which we could bridge Karate and the world of Windows. That became Karate Robot. It came together pretty quickly, actually. I think within a month, the first version was ready. It started being used in our team. And yeah, the team ran with it. It worked. It didn't fail. Robert, I think, I can kind of, I think one of the reasons is because it reuses a lot of the Karate goodness, right, that has evolved over a large period of time. So that's the answer, Kapil, right? That's how Karate Robot was created. And it's kind of a very strange, unexpected addition to the whole family of Karate projects. And Robert, you're probably one of the few people in the world who's used all of them now, like the API testing, the UI web part, and of course, the Windows part. There you go. So with that, let me ask Robert, a couple of questions. And now let's get to the really interesting stuff, which is, tell us about your journey with Karate Robot, some of the challenges, without, of course, I know you probably can't share too much details about the actual application, but in general, right, did you have a lot of legacy tools, or was it more of a straightforward .NET application? But just talk us through whatever you can remember that's interesting from the point of view of UI automation. And I totally agree with you, Robert. UI automation is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Go ahead.
Of course, especially that, as I mentioned, when I first joined, the platform was just starting, getting off the ground. So, we're using rapid development. So things are constantly changing. So, we're trying to stay as close to development as possible to kind of develop our test automation, follow, as closely as we can. But then as soon as something changes, it affects a lot of our tests. A lot of them fail, even if it's a a change in the element name or a minor change in the UI, especially if it's in a, in some of the landing pages, then it affects all of the tests. So there's just been this iterative, process of always playing catch up and developing, new tests for the new features. But I think the big advantage to using Karate in general, it's one of the few tools, if not the only tool, that you can do all these different types of testing with one tool, right? So you can do your API, you can do your web UI, and you can do your desktop automation. So you're not really switching contexts. In the past, I would be using, Protractor for our, web UI because we were using Angular, or Selenium, and then using Mocha for our API tests, and and then in the midst of it, using some Python scripts, and then Groovy for our CI development. You're just constantly switching contexts. Whereas with Karate, once you actually get to know Karate better, and it's a relatively easy thing to do, especially with the comprehensive documentation, you can then it's easier to kind of go back and forth. And like I said, in my case, I use all three components. So you have this, even though I'm primarily using robot, I still have the power of all these other features in Karate, that all the assertions, the reporting, the JavaScript function support, all of that available to me. So it's just a great package to really tackle your test automation challenges. And maybe I should elaborate just for a minute a little bit more on why I use all three. So the platform itself is a modern .NET platform, but we also have third-party components that to really just lift this thing off the ground is a challenge of its own, because we integrate with medical instruments, the robots that are in a medical lab. But for our purposes, we basically use simulators. But there's still third-party software that we need to integrate with. And when we actually launch the platform, all these other components need to be available and sometimes need to launch along with it. So we need to initialize the instruments, and to initialize the instruments, we need to use API calls. So prior to me actually starting up the Karate robot component, I issue some API calls to initialize the robot. And then in the meantime, we also have another third-party piece that it's a web application that we may, for certain workflows, need to generate some sample data. And so again, prior to launching the robot, we'll use the Karate core to then go into the UI and then generate some samples mixed with also generating some API calls. That application uses APIs with API endpoints as well. So there's all this kind of preconditions happening, and then finally we start the Karate robot and run our desktop automation tests with the robot. So it's just having all those three components as part of one framework made our life easier. And then the fact that you can have this report available to you, and then it could be embedded into your CI tool. We're using Jenkins. It's just really made this whole experience a lot easier. And on top of that, as I mentioned, we are FDA regulated, a lot of audits happening. We really have to be very strict about our how we develop and test our software. And so there's a system of record that we need to report our test results to. It's this layer that kind of sits above our automation framework that keeps track of all of our automation runs, and we need to report not just the test results, but any kind of errors that have been detected, any kind of basically all of the traceability that then can be provided as a test evidence to be supplied with the documentation when we release our platform. So in order to integrate with that system of record, thankfully they have a pretty extensive API. So with Karate, as we're running the tests, I'm using actually the functionality to write the test results into JSON files. So again, there's the Karate.scenario object that's available to you, where you can capture, the test results and all other data. You can capture the path to the test file, which we also provide as a test evidence. All of that information then is captured, and then as part of the post-execution, post-execution process, when that integration is enabled with the system of record through the APIs, again using Karate scripts, we push that data to then keep track of all of our test automation results. So there's this whole ecosystem, as you see. Karate Robot is the primary tool, but there's all these other components around that we need to integrate with. And thanks to Karate, we can do it all with one framework. And it's just been really, a great experience all around. I know I went on a bit of a tangent, but I hope I answered your question, Peter.
Oh, that was fascinating. And let me build on that. That's great, Robert. Thank you for sharing, because our previous webinar was about hybrid testing, actually, or one of them. And you have actually described, I think, the limits of hybrid testing, where you even include a desktop piece into the mix, which is great. And I like that you talked about the evidence part, right? That for compliance reasons, you really need to collect all this record of having run a test and all the things that may have gone wrong, or evidence that you've actually gone through checks, needed from a compliance standpoint. It's good for others on the call to hear this, because we get this ask from many other teams, especially enterprise teams, and it's good to know that you have a solution, because either Karate solves for this out of the box, or as you did, just make yet another API call. You could use Karate for that, because that's one of the best things Karate can do. And in fact, this is the mechanism by which many teams integrate with Allure and extent reports and test case management systems and all that. So it's good to hear, actual real life usage of that. You reminded me of a couple of things. One, making a note to self, because you made a comment about visual testing. You haven't got around to exploring it, but it just hit me that visual testing and desktop automation may be a very good match, especially for those cases where, you're not able to get a locator because it's some obscure old Delphi component or something. So that's something, for us to think about. You also reminded me that I now remember that there is a piece in Karate that does really good CLI testing, okay, which is invoking something on the command line and then starting processes. It could be Windows or Linux or any OS. But I now remember that it's because of Karate Robot that this piece had to be created in Karate, because in order for Karate to start a Windows application, this mechanism of being able to start an operating system process and listen to the output and keep it alive on a different thread had to be really solid. So thanks to Karate Robot, actually, I'm just thinking aloud here that Karate has this interesting option for testing anything that you can run on the command line. And I just want to mention again, for the benefit of the audience, that very recently we were talking to a team in the US who needs to test a lot of hardcore networking gear. And maybe you have something similar at Illumina. And I think the good news is that because Karate can invoke practically any operating system command and assert for whatever happens on the process output, it just gives teams yet another option for testing things that they normally wouldn't have dreamt of testing, if you know what I mean. So
absolutely, 100%. And Peter, I echo that completely. And it's something we actually use pretty extensively with our tests as well. So yes, being able to execute, system level commands. Yep. I mean, I even query a database using karate.exec. I run SQL queries. I run all sorts of system commands. We have tests where we need to, parse logs. So some of the logs are in a JSON format, but some are just, string, just the output, from the application where we parse them. So there's a number of different things that we do, and thanks to all that, all the functionality that you just mentioned that Karate comes with, we're able to, to run all those tasks. And again, it's all, encapsulated into one framework. We don't have to go out and use other, other tools, for parsing or running system level commands or any kind of, it's all part of, one framework. So it's a very common practice for us as part of our tests.
Thanks. And this is great thing about us having these talks with actual users and customers like you, because honestly, Robert, I never thought of using Karate exec to fire SQL commands. And I'll tell you the reason, because I've been from day one, you've seen, right? There's some utility classes that we recommend you use from Java to do SQL stuff, or, calling any, Java interop is a big part of the Karate documentation. But thanks, because I will now have one more option to actually ask, recommend to teams that, hey, if you already have, your database binaries or the clients available, which I think most teams would have, just do Karate exec and you can actually get some powerful stuff done with the database. So that's an option, awesome option. So I never thought of that. One question, curious, right? Because this is something I had to struggle with at Intuit, which is, and you said, Robert, that you use Jenkins, right? Are you able to successfully run Windows processes remotely with a UI using Karate Robot? Or did you face any challenges with that?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. Yes, that's another thing too. I just want to go on so many tangents when you ask those questions, but I'll try to stay focused. So yes, it was definitely a roadblock that we hit early on. So when I first started developing tests, I was running them on my development VM, and everything was for the most part working well. Some tweaks here and there, but I was able to to execute some tests and just kind of have that initial proof of concept and start adding tests. But then when when CI came into picture, when I was starting to build pipelines around it and running through Jenkins, we immediately ran into the issue where when we were using just unless you had an active session open on the Jenkins agent, otherwise you were not able to the tests would basically fail because the session would close and there was basically the tests would fail. So I worked with our DevOps team and SecOps team to come up with a solution for that. And the solution for that was to actually use the VNC server, where the difference between VNC server and I think it's the Microsoft remote desktop application. With remote desktop, once you exit the session, it closes the process. Versus with the VN server, it keeps the process open. It keeps the session open. And so using the VNC server on all of our Jenkins agents, we can log in and log out of the Jenkins build agent. But the tests will continue running. So that was the solution for that. It was definitely one of those things where I thought it was, at first I was a bit worried that we were not going to be able to run our tests in a really automated fashion using a CI tool, but we're able to solve that with the VNC server.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, and it brings back memories, right? In 2020, I was really having to do all this research on VNC and RDS, remote desktop, how it works. We did figure out in our teams, we use AWS. So, again, with the help of the DevOps folks, we were able to figure out, as you said, right? There were various semi-hacks involved, but it works. It's great. And I think one of the learnings is that I think you need to keep the resolution kind of standard, right? Because unfortunately, I think Robot has, because it relies on pixel movements so deeply, if you get your resolution wrong, you may have a bad experience. I don't know whether you ran into those kind of problems, but
no. Well, when the platform that we're testing it, by default it's maximizing the screen, so it's always full screen. Okay. So we haven't really had issues with with the screen resolution, and if that was more of a just being able to run them on an external server. And I did explore the AWS solution. Typically in the past, I've used on-demand agents where you only spin them up, when needed. Here we have these long-running VMs, simply because at the time, at least when I looked into it, Amazon only offered for Windows, I think it was the Windows 16 server, and we need the minimum requirement is the Windows 10 machine. So there was no solution, from AWS. So we need to have these long-standing VMs that are Windows 10 machines, and then that's when VNC server came really handy.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah.
Another thing I was reminded of, which I'll just mention for the benefit of the audience, is that we know of a team in the financial industry that's using Karate Robot for testing an Electron app. Okay, and this is interesting because there are two things happening here. An Electron app is based on Chrome. For those of you know, it's like web technologies used to create a desktop application. So Karate proved useful on two fronts. It could start the Chrome process, or it could just boot the application just like any other OS. And as soon as the screen came up, behind the scenes, because it's nothing but Chrome, Karate happens to have this excellent support for testing a Chrome browser. So it works. There are teams. I just want everyone to know that there are teams using Karate Robot for testing Electron applications, which are based on the Chromium embedded framework. Speaking of the Chromium embedded framework, I should also mention this, right? This particular application at Intuit that I had to test, and Karate Robot was created for, happened to be a hybrid application which had parts which are pure Windows, MFC, C++, all that stuff. And there were parts which are the new architecture, which is some of you may be aware of CEF, which is a Chromium embedded framework. It is basically a way to use Chrome within Windows forms, right? Embed a browser basically. And then once you have a browser working on the screen, any JavaScript or HTML technology could work to render user interfaces. And then there are some very elaborate ways of intercommunication between the legacy, quote unquote, Windows side and the browser side, which kind of works. It's surprising that all of this works, and all that. So I just wanted to mention this as a takeaway for people listening, that Karate is one of the few frameworks that can actually, as we talked about hybrid, right? Karate is one of the few frameworks that can test both Windows desktop applications, web browser applications, of course, make API calls and system CLI calls, and even test embedded Chrome applications. For those of you who have Electron apps lying around that need testing, this may be of interest, so I thought I would call that out.
And Peter, I would also like to add to that as well, since we're really focusing on the Karate Robot component here. I wanted to mention three other things that I think are very important to mention and for the audience to know. So again, in my case, we have very, very specific requirements, very detailed requirements as to what the platform is supposed to do, and all these other, edge cases and all these other, very elaborate, kind of scenarios that you can think of, right? And then as part of our requirements, that we have a large suite of them that revolve around installation of the platform. So I would also like to mention that before I even test the platform with Karate Robot, I can actually use Karate Robot to test the installer of the platform. So, and then, as part of the, when we run the MSI or the EXE installer, because there's a bundle installer, and then there's the bare bones, the MSI installer. There's a number of, options in there, configurations, and we need to test all of them. So the platform supports a number of plugins. So you can have, and there are a number of different authentication methods. You can have like a local auth, you can have a platform auth, you can have all these different, configuration settings. So with Karate Robot, we're able to test the installer of the actual product that we're later testing with. So that's something that, that I wanted to mention. The second aspect I wanted to mention is the ability to use keyboard shortcuts and just keys. So, again, we need to make sure that, when suppose that the lab technician, the platform runs on the desktop computer, and they may only have a keyboard and not a mouse. and they may not have a touchpad. So they really need to be able to use keys and the keyboard shortcuts to navigate through the UI, right? So theoretically, you could have two of the same tests where with one test you're clicking all the buttons, but with another test you have to use all of the keys and keyboard shortcuts, right? And again, karate enables you to do that. So I wanted to also mention that and in our tests, we have some tests that specifically use just keys and keyboard shortcuts, and in some cases it just makes it easier for me, especially when the UI becomes a little bit more complex and different stages of the workflow, where maybe a submit button or some other button we have to scroll down to, or there is some intricate scenarios. It's easier for me to just send the key.enter input, and it just passes through easily versus having to scroll and locate the element and stuff. So I also wanted to mention that as well. And there was one other thing. Oh, right. Early on, I remember I put in a feature request for you, which, by the way, you addressed right away, which was another impressive thing about working with you and using karate. Your response time is really amazing, and the fix was within a few hours, was being able to fetch the properties of the elements. And so, in our case, we have scenarios where we are, invoking some kind of a process, and a button is present on the UI, but a button is disabled. So as part of our, test, we need to verify that the button does not become enabled until, the software reaches, or the workflow reaches a certain point. And so again, with Karate Robot, you can find that property on that element and assert that, yes, it is, it is not enabled or is enabled, or what have you, any other properties that you are, that you might be of value to your test, they can be. And I remember the request that I put in, I think you only had like a subset of properties available, but once I put in a request, you included them all. And so you really, like, all the properties that are there on any given elements, you can get the values of them. So that's also another really great feature about Karate Robot, which we use pretty extensively in our test that I wanted to mention.
Oh, awesome! Thanks for sharing, Robert. Yeah, and I remember that particular change. And speaking of keyboard shortcuts, yeah, it's interesting how more important in the whole desktop world are keyboard shortcuts instead of using the mouse, right? It tends to be a thing. So it's and that reminds me, I know you tried. I don't remember actually, Robert, whether you were able to try modifying karate code while we were, I think, collaborating on trying to fix some of these problems or get some solutions. Did you actually manage to compile karate and rebuild it in order to try out some things? Just curious.
I did, yes. It was more recently, yes. It was the issue of not being able to locate a particular element. Before I get into that, again, thanks to the comprehensive documentation, it made that process super easy, right? So you have this, you have the instructions on how to build karate, which is very helpful. Again, there's also instructions on logging, how you can enable logging. There's using logback, right, for karate. So yes, there's different levels of logging that you can enable. And again, instructions are very clear, very helpful. And so with that, I was able to, enable logging, make some changes locally, build it, run it with it. And it was just a very, very, pleasant and easy process. What ended up happening though, there were some custom elements that were part of the UI that by definition, I think it's the WPF framework, was setting some of the properties. I think it was like a control view element, and one other property was setting them to false. And so with the standard view walker, I think it's the default view walker, you were not able to locate those elements. You had to switch to the raw view walker in order to be able to locate those elements. So I did play around with trying to make some updates to the karate logic. karate code, and it was of essence. In that case, we were getting ready to to our next release, and it was slowly becoming a bit of a rabbit hole. I was reading a lot of the I think it was IUI automation documentation that karate uses, right? And even in that documentation, which is from Microsoft, they were saying that some of those methods may not be fully reliable or fully fleshed out. So using the logback, I was able to verify that I was using the raw view walker, but yet I was still not able to locate those elements. So it was turning out to be a bit of a rabbit hole. So what ended up happening, I worked with our devs to basically set those properties to true. There were custom elements. On those custom elements, by default, they were set to false. So we were able to set them to true, and then we were able to locate them, and so on. And the reason why they were custom is there is on a UI there's a toggle that when you turn the toggle on, those elements become visible, and that's where the whole problem started. The elements were first not even visible. You turn the toggle on, they're custom elements, and by default the properties were set to false. So we found the mechanism to turn them to true, and then we're able to locate them. So, but the process of being able to turn on different levels of debugging and being able to locally build it and run with it was very, very very easy.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that, because I know many people have been able to contribute to Karate API. That's one of the first things that came out, and there's a lot of documentation already. But robot is relatively new, so I was curious as to how the experience is. But sounds like you were able to hack Karate and get it to change behavior and switch on and off logging. So that's great to know.
In fact, before we continue, sorry for jumping in, Peter. Let's pause. I'm just conscious of time. If anybody in the attendees has any question for you, because there are a few at least I have, but I'm just conscious of the time. Any questions, please raise your hand, and I can even unmute you and you can ask it live. Anybody? Nothing on the Q&A also. There's a good participation. So they've been listening very intently. So while I have a question, is there a limitation? Is there a challenge that you face? Or if you could fix that one thing, not necessarily in Karate Robot, but across Karate, if there is something that you could improve, is there anything?
So Peter touched on it briefly, being able to do, I guess, visual verification of some of the components of the desktop UI. So in our case, there are some parts of the UI where we have color coding for certain elements on the UI, and we have to currently we have to verify that manually that this color matches this element, right? And then in addition to that, we have these pictures of certain, they're called reagents, where we have to basically go in and click on the image and say, yes, this is the correct picture of the given reagent or tube or what have you. They're basically consumables that are part of the workflow. And so if there was a mechanism with Karate that we could visually verify, and those are pretty static things. I mean, the image doesn't change very often. Once we upload the image and it's it's in the UI, it's just the ability to take the baseline of it, that this is the image, and then in the consecutive runs we're basically comparing that the image is still the same. That would maybe one feature that would be helpful.
Excellent. A slightly different question, more on change management. What is the number one thing you have heard from teams as the resistance to embracing Karate? What is that?
Well, there are two things really. One thing is not so much resistance. It's just, you know, some other teams are well invested in the tools and technology that they chose, and there's, you know, there's a number of teams that, you know, have a lot longer, you know, that they've been, you know, their products are a lot more mature, and so just to make that switch from you know, from one tool to another is a pretty large endeavor, would be a pretty large endeavor. So I can totally understand it. You know, if somebody came to me today and say, hey, there's this other tool that you should use, and it's great, and it's new and shiny, has all this functionality, you know, I probably would be resistant as well, because I'm so well invested in this tool, and so, you know, so that's one thing. The second thing for me, and it's a bit of a more of a subtle thing, you know, karate is commonly known as this low code framework, right? Which I, by the way, love. To me, the simpler the better, right? To me, I always live by this motto that less is more, right? I often look at whatever code I write as like, can I write this in fewer lines? Can I achieve the same thing with fewer lines, right? And karate is a perfect example of that. With the simple keywords, you can achieve so much, right? And in the software development world, there's this mentality that, you know, you need to output a lot of code, and the, you know, the more code you write, the better. And so there's that sort of the resistance of, you know, that the tool is just kind of, I don't know, at least at a first glance, maybe, you know, not for sophisticated, you know, or senior, you know, developers and things like that, which I have been trying to like break through that stigma. It's like, no, it actually makes things a lot easier, and you can get from point A to B, to, you know, much faster by just, you know, just using its power. It's a very powerful tool, but, you know, there's that you know, there's so much simplicity to it, and there's a reason for it. So there's that.
Oh, wonderfully articulated. No, thank you so much for that. It's a fair bit to take in.
I think it was in one of the discussions before, I think Peter actually showed a diagram of, you know, as a software developer matures in their career, how they're, you know, basically writing less lines of code and then achieving the same, they're getting the same result. Is that right, Peter? I think I recall something like that.
Yes, it's like this curve. You start out writing simple code because you don't know anything, and then you learn a lot and you try to apply design patterns. You go through this hump of complexity, and then you gradually realize that you get older and wiser, that, you know what, simple code is the best. The less code you write, exactly as you articulated. Yeah, I had the diagram, and I use it in all my presentations now, actually, because it's so relevant, and you nailed it. Yeah.
Do you think there will be a degree of consolidation that is much needed in the plethora of frameworks and tools that are out there in the market, us included, when it comes to test automation?
You mean the need for consolidation?
Yes, need for consolidation, so that people are, you know, users, developers, quality assurance professionals, product owners, business stakeholders are able to do much more with maybe a fewer. So you think the industry would have a degree of consolidation? A lot of it has happened through acquisitions, where companies have continued to become bigger through acquisitions. But do you think that is the way, or will generative AI change the ability and drive that consolidation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, you know, karate is a great example. You know, you can do all these different types of testing with one framework, and I hear that whether it's available now or it's in the works, where you can now generate your API documentation. You know, with it, you obviously have the plugins for IntelliJ and VS Code and things of that nature. So I think you know, the bringing all of the tools into one, whether it's one framework or, you know, kind of a one umbrella, it definitely, you know, is, I think, will be beneficial for the, you know, for the development teams, and bringing all these different disciplines within the teams, like you said, you know, maybe product management and and QA and development, all those different disciplines within the development groups, kind of bring them together by, having more consolidated set of tools that, use the kind of underlying same technology, or kind of along the line with, with what karate is doing today.
Oh, wonderful. I think with the hoo-ha happening around generative AI in the market, I think the role of a quality assurance professional has just got further more heightened. As Peter says it very nicely, test automation is the last line of defense. And I think there is a huge opportunity out there. So that brings me to the last professional question before I ask you a personal question, which is, what would be your parting advice to the software testing community?
Sure. I would say be strategic, about your approach to test automation. Depending on what test automation you're tasked with, if you are, like in my case, where I had to start with the desktop UI automation, just tackle the kind of the low-hanging fruit first. Look for the more of an instant benefit of it, and then build on that, because you will quickly find that even if when I started out with the more kind of easier tests, easier things to develop, over time I found that there is still many tweaks that needed to be made in order to make it more reliable. So kind of start small, be strategic. Don't look at I'm going to automate this most complex, scenario. I'm going to start small, and then as soon as possible, try to run through CI, because again, it may work on your local, but once you start running in your CI environment, things may be different. And I ran into all sorts of things that we've touched on a little bit, and some others. So be strategic, start small, and start running it through the CI as quickly as possible. And another thing too, when you're developing tests, you sometimes just focus on one test. And then of course, karate and many other frameworks have the concept of tagging, right? So you tag tests into suites. And interesting things happen when you group things together, right? When you run tests as a test suite. Make sure that you're properly setting things up and cleaning things after execution of the test, especially when you're dealing with, a desktop application, like in my case, or, a web UI, things like that. Just be mindful of those things that, individual tests may pass, but once you throw it with a dozen other tests, things could act very differently, right? Another thing too to consider is fail fast. So, and there's many benefits to it. I typically try to stick to when I group tests into suites, for the execution time not to take longer than an hour. There are some tests, individual tests, in my case, that take upwards of like 3 hours, and it's just one test. But the tests that take shorter amount of time, make sure that they run no longer than an hour. And in your case, if you're spinning up on-demand, environment, you're saving yourself time and a lot of cases money also, by not running your tests for an hour and all of them failing because right out of the gate something fails. So try to maybe have like a smoke test run prior to actually running your test. If a critical part of your system is failing, there's no point to run everything else. And I think if I recall, Peter, I saw something in the 1.4 release notes that there is a method now to stop execution if a test fails, right?
Yes. You can call an API to set a flag, and then after that, any test sees that flag and would stop everything. So yeah, it's there.
Right. So fail fast. And then the third message that I would send is focus on negative, or not just focus, but don't forget about negative and error handling tests, right? So a lot of our testing activities we're testing the sort of the happy path scenarios, right? Where whether with APIs, we send the requests and, we expect the response, and, we we do our asserts and things like, but what happens if you're missing a header, right? Or what happens if if the data type is wrong, or what happens if your payload if your request is incomplete, and things like that. So in our testing, we have to do a lot of that, dealing with the instruments that I mentioned. What happens if there's a failure on an instrument, and how are we passing that, how are we handling that error on an instrument and our platform? So just as you're building your test suite, don't forget about the negative tests, basically, because it's just as important to make sure that your system under tests, whatever it might be, works just as well as what happens when an error occurs, right? How it's being handled. Does the application crash? Does it send you? Does it provide a user-friendly error, or does it just does it give you a stack trace, or what the behavior is? Those are the things that come to mind.
Beautifully summarized. No, thank you so much for that, Robert. This really helps, and I think this recording is going to be made available for public reference. I think it's beautifully summarized. When we release the post on thanking you, and when the recording is live on our YouTube channel, I think we'll summarize these salient points also in that post. Now, thank you for that. One final question. We know what you do in your free time, so thank you for sharing that personal aspect. But what specific music do you listen to?
Well, music has always been my biggest passions ever since I remember. I've always, music has always been present in my life. Listening to music, and later on playing music as well. Over the years, I've listened to just about any genre, but the types of music that I really enjoy, that's stuck with me over the years, is a lot of experimental music, a lot of soundtrack music, classical, jazz, that sort of thing. But I also enjoy, some of the mainstream. I enjoy hip hop as well. So it's really just a broad spectrum. It just depends on the mood, But I tend to often go into the experimental soundtrack, sometimes electronic ambient type music.
Oh, wonderful. No, thanks for sharing that. Peter, any parting comments?
No, this has been great. It's just awesome to hear about your whole journey, all the kinds of hybrid testing you're doing, and your takeaways are, I resonate with all of them, actually. I think we have a lot of similar thoughts about test automation. It's just great to hear them and get a lot of validation. Thanks.
That is brilliant. No, thank you for that, Peter. We thank you, Robert. Our biggest focus right now is continue scaling the adoption of karate, and that's why having power users and evangelists like yourself, like we have had since last year September, when SAP, FIS, Oracle, Trivago, Dell Technologies, all of them came and spoke, and now having you as part of the entire customer journey series is important for us to spread the word, create awareness, have a very transparent exchange of thoughts, and scale the adoption of karate. Our estimate is we are close to 400,000 monthly active users of karate open source. We want to take that to over 1 million in the next 12 to 18 months. So yes, there's lots of work to be done. So thank you so much for your continued support. Keep spreading the word, keep guiding us and challenging us. And yes, if there is any contribution you want to make, you know exactly who to reach and when to reach. Peter's always ready to hear from you. So thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you very much. And I also wanted to thank you for this opportunity. It's been wonderful. It's always been great interfacing with you guys. And karate is a great framework, and I'm happy to contribute and help you spread the message about it's great, its greatness. So I hope it only continues to grow and spread.
Thank you for that, and thank you for that, and I thank all our participants. We appreciate. We all have busy days. but it's really kind of you to register, take time, join. And since none of you had any questions, it must be the most convincing story that Robert has shared about Karate's capabilities. But if any questions, please drop us a note. Robert, if anybody wants to reach out to you, is there a best way for them to reach out to you, Robert?
Probably through my LinkedIn.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
No, good. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day ahead, Peter. Thank you so much. I know it's late. Good night. I'll catch you tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.